We're bringing you boots on the ground insight from the ranchers, conservationists, and partners who are helping to preserve the best of the Golden State for generations to come. Join the California Rangeland Trust for inspiring stories of resilience, innovation, and hope as we get tuned into the land.
Welcome to another episode of Tune Into the Land. I am your host, Michael Delbar, CEO of the Rangeland Trust. As we all know, ranchers and farmers are busy individuals, working every day to put food on our table and clothes on our backs. Despite their essential work, agriculturalists and the industry often face unjust criticism, stringent regulations, and ongoing challenges, making it increasingly difficult to farm and ranch in California. Over 100 years ago, farmers and ranchers realized that banding together to combat these issues was more effective than going at it alone. Thus, the Farm Bureau was born, a national grassroots organization that bolsters advocacy efforts for the industry and educates the public on its importance. Today, each state has its own organization and, along with county offices, support local farmers and ranchers in staying in business. We are delighted to be joined by the newly elected president of California Farm Bureau, Shannon Douglas. Shannon hails from Glenn County, where she and her husband farm a variety of crops and manage a small cattle operation. Together, we'll discuss the pressing issues facing California farmers and ranchers, the efforts of the Farm Bureau, and how organizations like ours can come together to strengthen our industry as a whole. So with that, I'd like to welcome Shannon to the podcast.
I'm so glad to be here. Glad to connect and visit.
I know your schedule is very tight. You're getting ready to fly out for a few days on a multifaceted trip. So thank you for taking time from your busy schedule and sharing that with us. So Shannon, tell us a little bit about yourself. Your background, you didn't really come from agriculture, and now you're leading the largest farm organization in the state of California. So tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got there.
Absolutely. So I was raised in Sacramento. My family is several generations removed from agriculture, but we had, in fact, the closest connection really is my great-great-grandfather was a logger up in Humboldt County. That's our biggest connection. Then my great-grandfather managed the Glenn-Colusa Irrigation District just, a few years ago. But really, my family was not closely tied to production ag. My mother, though, was a first-generation American. Her parents were both immigrants here. And when she was in high school, she accidentally got into horses. The story goes, basically, there was a very obese horse, frankly, in her neighborhood that she would pass by on her way home from school and stop and pet. And the owner had been told, if this horse doesn't get some weight off of it, you need to get someone riding it or it's going to get worse. And so one day when my mom was petting the horse on her way home from school, they said, "Hey, would you like to ride the horse?" And my mom said yes, and then learned how to ride a horse and got involved in 4-H and that sort of thing. So while we didn't have this agricultural tie. They grew up in a very urban setting. When I was born, my family had kind of a small homestead type thing where they had a couple horses and goats and chickens and, things like that, depending on the year, pigs and that sort of stuff. So I'm first generation farmer, but multi-generation 4-H'er, and that kind of paved the way for my love of agriculture. So I went to East Nicholas High School, and I had a fantastic ag teacher there. They got me more excited. And just as I continued to grow, I found that, wow, this is this really interesting place. I love the kind of thing they do. I really like this ag stuff. And so it just kind of kept snowballing. I majored in ag in college and met my husband during college. And my husband was from an agricultural background, so his family did farm. They were dairy farmers, although they were no longer dairying by the time he graduated high school and we met. So we had to really kind of bootstrap things and grow from there. So these days, my husband and I and our son, we have beef cattle. We do end up with some dairy animals because, again, I think that's genetics. So we actually have a couple that my son shows. So we've got a few Holsteins to just kind of confuse the neighborhood. And then we have a diversity of crops. So we grow forage crops, sometimes corn, not this year. We're not growing a lot of corn, but we grow alfalfa, hay crops. We rotate in sunflowers, and we grow walnuts as well. So we've got a pretty big mix of things, but I had a pretty unconventional journey to get here. So I always kind of think it's fun when people go, oh, well, as a multi-generation farmer. And I have to be like, well, that's actually what the one I'm not as experienced in. question. So, but glad to be here and glad to be part of an industry that has opportunities for somebody with a unique background like mine.
So tell us how you got involved with Farm Bureau and explain for those who maybe aren't as familiar, what is Farm Bureau? How does the organization operate?
Yeah. So let me kind of break that into the two parts. So Farm Bureau is over 100-year-old organization. And when Farm Bureau was founded, we were founded as a way for farmers in local areas to come together and say, we need farm advisor support. So really they came together and said, hey, we have a bunch of hay farmers here. We have a bunch of sheep ranchers here, whatever it was at the time in the county. And they said, we are going to need, this is the type of advisor we need. So that cooperative extension system was getting put together at that time. And these farmers got together, they could talk about the issues that were important to them, the challenges that they were facing. A lot of that was research things at the time, but very quickly it's evolved. And today we are the largest farm organization in the state, representing about 20,000 farmers, and then an additional 8,000 or so people who are supporting the work that farmers do in the state. And we represent a huge diversity of crops. So we cover from livestock and dairy, all the way to horticultural crops, of course, row crops, orchards, and really everything in between. We're incredibly diverse. We exist in 54 counties across the state, and a couple of those are combined counties. So Plumas, Sierra operate together, and Yuba Sutter operate together. But this last winter, we actually included San Francisco joined as a Farm Bureau, which is kind of its own, unique and fascinating thing that people in San Francisco have an interest in creating a Farm Bureau. And we're glad to have them as part of the team. So Farm Bureau is a grassroots advocacy organization. Those counties, those 64 counties that I mentioned, they have county farm bureaus locally. But then they also are involved in our state organization, and California Farm Bureau is involved in American Farm Bureau, where they help advocate for us on national issues too. Our state organization, we have about 70 employees working on our members' behalf every day. We're headquartered in Sacramento with a satellite office also right downtown, so it can be close to the Capitol and all the important work we need to do there with such great frequency. But our staff are working on everything from advocacy publications. So we have a weekly newspaper. We have a quarterly magazine that's designed really for a non-farm member. We produce a variety of newsletters. We have a television show called California Bountiful that's promoting farming and agriculture and local food in TV stations really across the state, and a YouTube channel with that as well. We've got a podcast. We've got a whole communications division. And then we've got staff working in legal, in government affairs, which is focused on our stateside politics, in federal policy, and so much more. So we have a lot of things happening at California Farm Bureau to advocate for farmers and ranchers. So that's really the core of what we do, is we try to make sure that our farmers, our members, can stay farming in California in the future, and that they can have as productive of a business as possible. So that's really what Farm Bureau does. I got involved in Farm Bureau in college. And for me, as someone from outside of ag, it was very important, I think, to really get tied into these organizations. So particularly, there was a campaign in Butte County that was looking to do away with genetically modified seeds being able to be grown in the county. I ended up, because of some of the other clubs I was involved in, getting pretty involved in the campaign. Of course, there were the real campaign leaders doing it. But I got to, as a student volunteer, get involved in interviews and bringing guest speakers and going and knocking on doors. And I found that it was such an important and interesting way to get involved. And that because I didn't come from an ag background, I had a bit of a different perspective that I could share. And in some ways, it seemed like I could maybe relate a little bit better because I could kind of break things down. For me, I've had to learn it all too. So I can kind of break it down a little bit differently than someone who just knows this because they were raised in it and it's second nature to them. Because it wasn't second nature to me, that could help. And we were successful in that campaign. And it was so exciting to see, wow, we can really do this and make a difference. And while there was, of course, an official campaign, it was really Farm Bureau that was so involved in it, and Farm Bureau members that were making that happen. And being a part of the good work and seeing that, wow, we accomplished something here. It really showed me that the vehicle for making a difference in agriculture was going to be Farm Bureau. And so I got involved when Kelly and I, Kelly was already in Orland, but when I settled in Glenn County, getting in our young farmers group going, it was really helpful for us just to have a group of friends that you had so much in common with. And, but people had other challenges, and you helped you find the resources and the networking value to all of that. So it just kind of kept snowballing from there. Eventually I got on the statewide F&R committee. I became the chair of the statewide F&R committee a number of years ago. I got involved in a ton of different leadership development programs with Farm Bureau and outside, including California Ag Leadership. Got involved in American Farm Bureau. And just, the more you get involved, the more opportunities arrive, and you keep going, okay, this is good. I can make a difference here. I can help. I think this is a worthwhile effort. And then about 7 years ago now, I ran for statewide Farm Bureau office and was elected our first vice president back then. And just in December, elected president of California Farm Bureau. So I got involved really in college and just saw the value of what we could do and what we can accomplish. And that's still such a huge part of why I stay involved today, is that really Farm Bureau is such a critical vehicle for making a difference in California ag.
So now that you are the president, you're the first female president of California Farm Bureau. Congratulations on that milestone. So what does it mean to you to be the first female president of this large organization?
I think it really is helpful from a representation space. We know that well over 30% of the farms in this country are owned and operated by women. There's some great data if you ever want to go into those. Farms that are run by women are actually more profitable too. So, there's probably some good info happening there. And we know we've been involved in agriculture, and we do tend to be a more male-dominated industry, but I think it's helpful to show that isn't completely the case. And just because there's a lot of men in the industry doesn't mean there's not a place for women, doesn't mean there's not an opportunity. And I think it does indicate the willingness of our industry to be willing to take a look at different perspectives. And in the fact that I'm an elected person. So our membership elected me. They had to be willing to say, this is someone we want to work with. And there was no requirement of adding a woman or anything like that. This was purely by choice for our members. And so I think that's helpful, but I am glad it shows that there is opportunity. We know that coming out of the college programs, for example, it's been heavily women for a number of years now. In ag programs, there have been more young women than men graduating from the colleges, particularly in California, for quite some time now. So we know there's definitely a changing face in our industry, and probably in other industries, of course, too. But I'm really glad to be a part of it.
So as the president, what are some of your goals or focus areas that you have for your term?
Yeah, right now we have a lot that's been happening at Farm Bureau, and a lot of big changes that have been happening. And I think part of that is important to continuously adapt. I think that so I'm in Glenn County, and I can remember talking to people about, as our industry has evolved and the changes that we've seen, and sometimes we forget that we are continuously evolving. So 40 years ago in Glenn County, we had a lot more kiwi production. And today, I don't know that we have any, right? We have, or very little. We had a lot more dairies. We've got a fraction of what we used to. We have a whole lot more nuts and orchards than we had before. Our production practices have changed. All of those things adapt. And so as we as farmers and ranchers are constantly adapting, using new tools, et cetera, whether it's technology or just changes in practices and products, but our organizations have to adapt too. And so the modernizing and adapting of our organization is really pretty critical right now. We're talking about people wanting information in different ways. So, for example, Farm Bureau has our own podcast now that we started just a few months ago, recognizing that our members, they don't always have time to sit down and read newsletters and publications that we've been sending, but people want to get the information. And so being able to provide it in audio clips that they can play in the truck and driving down the road adds value and helps us to adapt their needs. So really that adaptation piece is really important right now at Farm Bureau as we try to recognize what do our members want and need, and how do we best provide it?
I think one of the things that we've noticed lately and that our landowner partners need, and I'm assuming you see it personally and at the Farm Bureau too, is to discuss what is next for their operation. USDA states the next 20 years, I think it's 70% of operations in the U.S. face that question of how that transition is going to occur and who's that next generation going to be. How do you feel we should encourage these young farmers and ranchers to take the reins as the transition occurs?
So I think there's two pieces on that. For me, the first piece is really encouraging that those conversations about the transition have to happen. I've always been frustrated as a beginning farmer and as a new farmer in the numbers. There are often, grant programs, and there's this data shared about how we have all these retiring farmers and we need to figure out who's going to take over. And if only we could get people excited to take over and take over this farmland. And I don't know about your experience, but mine sure is that there is no shortage of people that want to be farming. People want to be involved. Nobody is saying, I don't want to be in farming. If only I knew how to farm, I would happily do that. I've never seen that as an experience. Maybe there's a few people like that, but by and large, they're ready to do it. Where I think the biggest breakdown has been is so often talking about a farm transition is a challenging topic because for many farmers and ranchers, they don't retire so well, right? They slow down perhaps, but very few actually retire, whether that's dad or grandpa or grandma, whoever it might be. They tend to stay pretty involved, right? And so farm transition plans really involve discussions about death and dying. And those are not fun topics to have. What are we going to do if mom passes away and then dad and figuring out what that's going to look like? Those are tough. And so very often we just put those conversations off and we don't talk about it. And then it's sometimes too late. I've seen that in a couple cases recently where I knew people that were really starting the process of the transition planning. But we're not far enough along, unfortunately, when things changed at a quicker rate of speed, and they weren't able to adapt. They didn't have the tools in place to make that transition happen. So I actually think a huge piece of the farm transition is having those conversations. Again, not fun. Nobody wants to do it over Thanksgiving dinner. Nobody wants to do it after opening Christmas presents. But if we don't have those discussions, too often you can find that, one sibling wants to do one thing, the other wants to do something else. And if the transition's not in place, very likely there's going to be a for sale sign out on something. So I think recognizing that is a big piece of it. But I think that we also have to share, and I've talked to a number of friends about this in the last few years, actually, agriculture, farming, it's hard, right? Being a rancher is hard, but also really enjoyable. We know that our people love the work that they do. And yes, it's trying. In many ways, any kind of a business owner in California faces some tremendous challenges just from the fact of the state that we're in, et cetera. But the perks to it, and the time you do get with your family. And while I can tell you, our family works a pretty crazy hours and schedule, we also do it together. Yes, I had an early morning this morning. We had a bit of a challenge with some livestock challenge, frankly, this morning, but it's my husband and I standing there together doing it at, dark 30. And it's our son being involved and helping and all that time that we really do get to spend together that has value. And I think highlighting that because too often our challenge, and we saw this particularly in the 80s, that times were really tough. The farm was really hard. And so our families were discouraging the next generation from coming back. They were saying, go do something else. You don't want to be a part of this. Like, go do something else. And we of course are always going to want what's best for our children. But I think we want to, when possible, give them the opportunities for this lifestyle and the encouragement for, we do want you to do what's going to make you happy. We'd love it to be the farm. If that's the case. There are great opportunities here. Here's where the challenges are. But finding the balance for that, I think, is going to be really important, and sharing that, yes, it's tough, it's challenging, but it's a worthwhile life.
Those discussions do need to occur. Rangeland Trust put on a session just last week and on the Central Coast, and it was sold out from ranchers wanting to get more information on how to have those conversations, what they should be looking for, how's that transition going to play out for them. So I think that the interest is there, the desire is there, and it's our roles to help those conversations happen.
Definitely. I think taking out the stigma of it, just, talking about what's going to happen doesn't mean we want that. Doesn't mean we're trying to speed any of that up, but we can make the best things happen when we have all the information. Circling
back to California Farm Bureau for a second, you've had a lot of changes in the organization itself. Besides your change in officers, You've also have a new COO, I guess. It used to be called an administrator. Now it's a COO. You have some new staff. What's the outlook from your perspective? I know it's been there's been some challenges, but you've got a great team there. And what's your outlook?
Very positive. We're really excited. Our new COO starts on July 1st, and Dan Durheim is coming to us with really several decades of Farm Bureau experience. And that is really, really exciting for us. He's got a great relationship, having worked at American Farm Bureau, and really understands our farm challenges, our farm issues. He understands the organization. And we're so pumped to really have him hit the ground running for us in just the next couple of weeks. So that's been really exciting. And it's been really exciting as well, because it has bringing a COO on board has been arguably probably an 18-month process almost, because that started with our members. So as I mentioned earlier, we are a grassroots organization. And so a year and a half ago, I guess, our members said, hey, we think we want to look at what our organization looks like, what it should look like. And so they started having a series of meetings. One of the results of that was this, saying that we actually think we need a chief operating officer, someone who's going to make sure the business of things are running. And let's take a shift in how we look at this. And so to go from there to then, be here this time now and having that person about to come in that seat is really exciting, and really see our members' wishes come true. Our other big change this year has been with Ag in the Classroom. Our executive director, who'd been there for 4 decades, retired. And so congratulations for that exciting shift in life. And we're very happy for Judy getting to enjoy retirement now. But we brought in someone who'd been on our board. So Becca Whitman is just a wonderful human, a great ball of energy. And we are really excited because there was a tremendous foundation built over 40 years. And now we can kind of keep playing with things. And we've seen just in the last few years, some changes, some because of COVID, but a tremendous more access for people to use those resources, more outreach to the homeschooling community, those types of things. And I just cannot wait to see what Becca continues to do with Ag in the Classroom. But we're really, really pumped for our new COO at California Farm Bureau. It's going to be a really exciting summer.
Well, we will echo your accolades for both Judy and then the foundation she built for the foundation, but as well as with Becca. We've had the honor of working with Becca for many years in her previous life, and we're very excited for both Ag in the Classroom and for Becca. It's a great selection.
Yes, we're so happy. It makes it a lot of fun.
So as you mentioned, policy is one of the main areas of focus that Farm Bureau works on. As this legislative session comes to a close, what are some of the big policy issues that Farm Bureau and the industry in general is facing this year?
I think it's important to say one of the things I've done the last 6 months has been working to try to enhance the offerings basically from our advocacy side of the house, because the demands are just so heavy in Sacramento. We, and your listeners, of course, are going to understand, but our state legislature is typically working on 2,500 to 3,000 bills a year. Just tracking and reading those alone is a big undertaking, but there is a lot of content, a lot of opportunity for things to be snuck in there. And it's critical that we have a lot of time spent watching those. So I think that if you think about right this year in particular, probably our 3 biggest, but then of course we've got some animal things happening as well. I know you've been following what's going on over in Sonoma, but water continues to be a really critical piece of what we do. It's why we have several dedicated lawyers, and we have one of our lobbyists just works on water. So it's continues to be very critical. And not only the access to the impacts of SGMA, a lot of pieces there on water, because it's so critical for our farmers to have water to grow food. We've also had a lot on labor this year. It's been, and that's a little bit on the federal side, but primarily on the state side, as we continue to really be challenged, not only with the labor environment that we face, but also the additional restrictions on how and offerings you're required to do for your employees. So that those things all make it super challenging. And then this year, another really big piece has been the mill assessment and the push to really increase our costs of our farm inputs, frankly. It's pretty darn enormous. But then I also can't miss the dealing with insurance. I almost have to break it down by staff person, I think, in my head as I'm kind of going through. We know that and I would argue, especially for our ranchers, because of if you're in a foothill community, the impact that insurance has been the last few years and continues to be. And we are at Farm Bureau, not only do we have a sponsored bill this year working on trying to collect data on the health impacts of smoke from wildfires so that we can continue pushing for better forest management and wildfire mitigation, recognizing that this isn't just a personal property issue. This is also a public health issue, frankly, if we can't get this better contained and managed, but also trying to get our members access to insurance. We've worked the last years to expand the ability of farmers and ranchers to utilize the FAIR plan, which admittedly is not perfect, of course, but it's something, and we want to make sure we have as many tools as we can. But our insurance in California is an absolute mess. So don't want to, of course, forget insurance on the list. But then we've also been this year had some Williamson Act discussion too. And Farm Bureau has been a long, solid supporter of maintaining the Williamson Act. But there are some challenges in the valley where they aren't having water. So we're trying to figure out what's a way to help those farmers there while also trying to maintain the integrity of a tax protection that is so helpful, particularly to our farmers and ranchers, but really to anybody preserving open space in California.
So there was a bill in this last legislative session in regard to Williamson Act, and it was to exempt solar developments from paying a cancellation fee. Williamson Act contracts are between the county and landowners, and they're a great tool, the best bang for the buck conservation tool out there. It's a rolling 10-year contract that bases the property tax on the income potential of the land, of the agricultural land. The concern amongst many is the integrity of that act. If we lose it and we jeopardize that, it's such an important tool for farmers and ranchers across the state. How does Farm Bureau view the need for renewables and the siting of such renewables in regard to the Williamson Act contracted lands?
Yeah, that's what we are having we've got a working group together actually right now discussing it, because what we're seeing, we have farms in particularly the south part of the valley who, because of SGMA restrictions, they're not going to be able to grow anything. Because of restrictions on the way we can use water, particularly in the south and central part of the state, it is making it so that we have farmers in counties like Kings and Tulare and Fresno and others as well, that they are not going to be able to use water on their fields. They are not going to be able to farm. And so we recognize that is a tremendous hardship. And we're trying to figure out how to provide some help there. Some people are seeing solar as a solution. There are concerns, though, about a solar farm on your neighbor's piece. How does that affect your ability to do things? Does that change long-term capabilities on it? So there's even some data as well out of Washington just in the last few months about the challenges of converting ground that's been used for solar back to productive farmland, and that can actually take 20 years potentially to get it turned around after a 25-year solar lease. So it's a really challenging problem. And the way we try to look at these problems from a California Farm Bureau perspective is because, again, we are grassroots, our members talk through it. So our members decided decades ago how important the Williams Act was to us, and we have steadfastly defended it since then. From a legal perspective, from a legislative perspective, we've really stayed strong on Williamson Act, and we want to continue to do that. But we also recognize that there are challenges our members are facing. So we're trying to kind of marry those things right now and figure out what that looks like. Some of that discussion is there is a way, as you mentioned, that Bill we'd sponsored a number of years ago to allow some solar development. From what we've learned, it's only been used for about 4 different projects since that was enacted. And so they're, kind of finding out, well, what have those hurdles been? Because there is a way now. And it sounds like it just might be a little bit too cumbersome from the perspective of solar. to do. So trying to navigate that. But I mean, really the core of what we do is we talk through it with our members. Our policy still stands as extremely pro-Williamson Act, frankly. And I believe it'll continue to be that way. Of course, that is so important to our members, but we're also trying to look at, all right, how do we provide some help to the members in the Valley that have this challenge? So really, we're certainly working through that now. I don't have a great solution for you yet, but we're certainly trying.
No, thank you. And I know that Farm Bureau has been that strong voice consistently in preserving and protecting the integrity of this important Williamson Act. Another one that's coming up that's going to have reverberations across the state is the initiative in Sonoma County. Tell us a little bit more about that initiative real briefly and what Farm Bureau is doing to help combat that.
So Sonoma County has the misfortune this year of dealing with some activist challenges, and they've had a variety of anti-animal ag activists for a number of years showing up on farms and the poultry facilities, etc. And what they have brought forward this year is a local ballot measure that essentially would just end livestock production in Sonoma County. And they are really under the guise of a CAFO, it being a confined animal feeding operation, but their distinction for that is quite large. And as you're probably well aware, in Sonoma County, most of the dairy farms are actually organic. A lot are grass-based. So these are mostly pasture-based cows. So by our industry standards of what confined feeding looks like, it is not generally pasture-based organic dairies. And so this activist group is seeking to kind of redefine that locally and would absolutely shut down animal agriculture there in Sonoma. The Sonoma Farm Bureau has been extremely involved. And if you have not talked to Dana, she would be a great interview, or Doug Beretta. I think together they were on our California Farm Bureau podcast talking about it just a couple of weeks ago. We supported them. We've been financially supporting that as well, early on, especially because it's so critical to work on this locally. They frankly have great support from their county board of supervisors that has realized how problematic this would be, the devastation this would be to the economy, the number of jobs lost, and the businesses and the processing, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it is really telling about the battles we constantly have and the reason why our advocacy organizations are so important. If there wasn't a Farm Bureau in Sonoma County, this might be happening at someone's kitchen table that they'd be trying to battle this. And the infrastructure we have as an organization is just so critical to be able to mobilize in times like this with this unfortunate Sonoma initiative. I think it really is indicative of the challenges we continue to face and again, to our point earlier, why it is so challenging to continue farming in this state. You know, they're doing some great work and great things, and then your neighbors try to tell you what you're doing shouldn't be allowed at all.
Yeah, and you know that getting that on the ballot wasn't always the right information being shared with those who signed the petition. But I also know California Cattlemen's and other livestock organizations are also joining that effort to work together to defeat this. Because if it happens in Sonoma, that's just going to be the first domino to fall. They'll be coming after the same operations in all the other counties.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, they picked Sonoma because it being fairly urban. They didn't start with Stanislaus County, but our ag groups coming together is really important. So we've, of course, been very involved, and we're thankful for the other groups that have joined in. This is for sure a team effort.
So let's springboard off of that a little bit. Where do you see this California Farm Bureau? And so oftentimes what I hear and others hear, that's Farm Bureau is about farmers and not necessarily ranchers. But as a rancher yourself, and many of us in the ranching business are members of both our livestock organizations as well as Farm Bureau. Where do you see ranchers playing a role in the organization?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And it's interesting because depending on someone's perspective, Farm Bureau looks different to everybody. We have people who think that Farm Bureau is only for the big farmers, and then the big farmers that think it's only for the small farmers. And, I tell you, like probably the first hint of what our Farm Bureau looks like and our makeup is if you take a look at our photos of our board members. a lot of cowboy hats in our board photos. And that's because we really do have a lot of ranchers. And of course, ranchers who don't wear cowboy hats either. I personally don't own a cowboy hat or anything, but we do represent a diverse group. And we're glad when people are involved in multiple organizations. But I think you'll find I've got beef cattle. Our second vice president, Ron Peterson, also has beef cattle in addition to his dairy. So we're pretty darn closely tied on all fronts. And, depending on this part of the state you're in, I think sometimes we have areas where people have gotten really involved because of some local issues, of course. And so maybe they've leaned on Farm Bureau more heavily, for example, than their cattlemen's. And, we only have so much time. So we know that people are sometimes have to, hopefully they're involved in both, but you might have to, pick one or the other depending on where your stage in life is. But I do think it's important for people to know that while Farm Bureau is big and diverse, we are representing all sizes of farms, all types of farms, and frankly, we represent a heck of a lot of cattle, both beef and dairy, up and down the state. And so I think it's a really good place to be involved in, particularly to talk about the intersection of some of these issues. We have a livestock subcommittee that works, our livestock committee rather, and then our subcommittees for beef and dairy, because we still recognize the important differences to discuss there. But it's going to continue to be important to be engaged. And I think that for so many of our farmers, as they continue to need to diversify, being involved in a diverse organization is going to be really helpful in that, and potentially pretty efficient for you too.
Well, the Sonoma issue being a good example, and you and I have had this conversation before, the importance of these agricultural groups working together. The collaboration is so important. We can't approach this. This is my area. You've got your area, and work independently and without any cooperation. It is so important that we collaborate. How do you see ways in which our organizations, whether that's the California Farm Bureau, California Cattlemen's, the wool growers, other ag organizations, both on the farming and the ranching side, can and should work more collaboratively on some of these issues that are so important to the industry as a whole?
Yeah, I think working collaboratively is absolutely critical. And I think it can be a challenge because sometimes even from a member perspective, sometimes our members want to know, well, what did you do? What did you do that was different than them? And there are times when perhaps we get, as you maybe alluded to, sometimes kind of territorial over our thing, like, no, this is my area. And what we want to do, though, is recognize what's best for our industry as a whole. That's not always the most PR-friendly path, right? That's not the one that you can swing your flag about as easily. But by working together, we're just so much stronger. And so it's a combination of just having really open dialogue about it. And I think really coming from a place of truly wanting to make sure we're doing what's best for the industry. There are times when frankly, we can, tag team on things. And, the Williamson Act is important to Farm Bureau. It's also important to you guys. It's also important to the California Cattlemen's. And so where we can collaborate, even if our approaches aren't necessarily the same, but they're aligned and we communicate on them, all of that adds value. So I think, number one, it's coming from a place of really wanting that. But I think the second part of that is really being willing to have that dialogue. I'm really appreciative that our advocacy staff, frankly, has really good communication with really nearly all of the ag groups to say, hey, here's where we are at on this. We recognize that you guys might be in a different place, but kind of here's where we're at. And so I think it comes from really coming from that place of wanting that for a very genuine place of that being the goal, and recognizing where we have those shared values, but then taking the time to do it and really taking the time to say, we're going to make time to talk about this, and we're going to make time to visit because your opinion matters too. Your perspective matters. And while, again, we might not come out of the room agreeing on it all, we at least have the discussion. We know where everybody's at, and we're really coming from an honest place on it. I think all of that helps with that foundation building.
Agreed. It's a divide and conquer with the folks like the ones behind the Sonoma Initiative. And if we don't, as an industry, stand together and support one another, then that next segment of the ag industry is going to be on the chopping block.
Absolutely.
So we've got to stick together. We've got to collaborate and really stand there for the industry as a whole.
Yes. Now we have to. If we don't stand together, we're a lot easier to pick apart and pick off. we are stronger together. That's actually our theme for our Farm Bureau annual meeting this year. And it's kind of turned into our theme of the year, basically, that whether we are talking about us as farmers individually, us as organizations, our staff, when we are working together, we are so much stronger. And in an industry where we are talking about, we used to say 2%, now we're probably more like 1% of the population, we can't be picked off and divided off. We have to recognize that we are going to need to work together. And if we don't, frankly, the results of that are just too damning, I would say, to even want to talk about, right? We can't let ourselves be picked off. We have to be willing to work together. It's going to be tough conversations and it's not always going to be fun, but it's critical to the survival of our industry that we work together.
The big issues that we all face is the loss of our working lands, whether it be ranch lands or farmlands. We all know that we're losing those lands to conversion at an alarming rate. What is the importance from your perspective of protecting these working lands in California?
Our working lands are absolutely critical. We really can't do the work we do without the land, right? And if we don't work to protect it, we continue to see the impacts in so many different ways. So we sometimes talk about just like losing that land, right? And that is critical as well. But when you start to that fringe of town, start to encroach out, when you see more of the ranchettes and when you see just more houses come into our working area, that impacts us in everything from our ability to, utilize crop protection tools, utilize airplanes. These are two specific ones I've thought of recently. And all of that, when all of that starts changing, then the infrastructure changes too, right? If fewer planes can fly, then maybe you don't have all the aviation options you used to have. And when your protection tools start to become limited, those retailers start to become limited. All of that ends up being related. And so maintaining working lands, I think, is a really critical component of that because it really helps us hold the ground on everything else we do. I mean, literally hold the ground too, right? But kind of hold the line, I suppose, would be the better term to use in this case. But when we can hold the line and recognize that preservation and the value of it, that helps all your neighbors. If your neighbor's ranch ends up in some kind of an easement, I think that by and large is going to help you, right? That helps maintain, less likely that subdivisions come in nearby. And I think we would argue then society overall, because if we can really kind of contain that urban encroachment, that's got value for our farms, for our wildlife, et cetera. So I think it's really a pretty big cornerstone in the work we're trying to do and the important impacts it has on the neighboring farms and ranches.
We're proud to have protected permanently 395,000 acres across the state, but equally as proud of the fact that we have nearly 225,000 or more acres in our pipeline of 95 ranching families that want to protect those lands. That, I think, says a lot about the desire of the ranchers in California and across the country of protecting the land, standing the ground, as you say, because it's without that, we don't have anything else. We can't grow our crops on asphalt and concrete. It just doesn't work.
No, it's really bad on the cow's feet.
Shannon, I know you've got a plane to catch and you've been very generous with your time today. We want to thank you for sharing it again with us and your great insight. Again, congratulations on the new role. And thank you so much for doing what you do. And we wish you and California Farm Bureau the best of success.
Absolutely. Thank you. We're glad to work with you all. Look forward to continuing that and very exciting times ahead.
We hope that you enjoyed this episode of Tune Into the Land. If you are wanting to learn more about the work that the Farm Bureau is doing, you can visit their website at cfbf.com. Be sure to hit that follow button so you can be notified when the next episode is released. And if you like what you are hearing, leave us a review and share our podcast with your friends. This closes the gate on another episode of Tune Into the Land. I'm Michael Delbar. Thank you for listening.